So joining me now are Erin Richards, our education reporter, Dan Bice, our watchdog columnist. Last week when we were here, we were talking about the MPS turnaround plan, takeover plan. That's been revised this week in the budget, but it's there, so something is happening. Can you tell us, Erin, about the changes and what's the impact here on MPS in particular?
Right, so two Republican lawmakers inserted a pretty large provision in the state budget that would essentially put into state law that there would be a commissioner appointed by Milwaukee County Executive Chris Abele that would control a select number of low-performing schools in Milwaukee. That's a big change from now because the school board wouldn't have any say about what would happen in those schools. The commissioner would control the buildings. There's still some question about how that sale would work because the city technically owns the buildings right now. At the same time, Milwaukee Public Schools is taking up their own plan tonight in a meeting to say, wait, let us do this. We'd rather work our own plan to give our own superintendent more authority over her own buildings. Essentially, they want to keep control of the buildings and they don't want someone else to take them over.
Is that sort of a genuine interest in this sort of reform, or is this, well, this bus is coming, let's try to steer it a little bit, in our direction?
Well, I think between negotiation and getting the hammer from somebody in Madison, you'd take negotiation. So I think this is a step to try to say, well, let us work with our own authority.
But the bigger question is, do the Republicans in Madison care what the MPS board is doing? They don't generally. They haven't in the past. So they'll probably end up doing what they want to do on this.
And I think the question is the action too little, too late?
All right, let's talk about some of the other changes in the budget. So the education piece is more or less set now by joint finance. You had a great story this morning, Erin, on how it all played out. But who are the winners and losers here? Public schools got some of the money reinstated that Governor Walker had cut, but they don't seem to feel like they're big winners.
Depends on what side of the fence you're on. Public schools say, okay, we got a little bit of a bump in the second year of the budget. We're grateful that the funding cut was restored in year one, but you're sending a lot more of the finite pool of education funds to private schools by way of this statewide voucher expansion. So in the long run, public schools are saying this is the worst of the worst for us. We're going to have less money going forward, and we're going to have more kids on the public dime that weren't there before.
It's still not as bad as it could have been. I mean, had they taken Walker's proposal and gone with it, correct?
It could have been worse. I think it could always be worse. So yes, the restoration of the funding in the first year was a good thing for public schools in their eyes. At the same time, nobody saw the last minute insertion of a special needs voucher bill, which would also take $12,000 per kid. Should someone with a child with a special need take advantage of that option?
Senator Vukmir has been pushing that proposal for a long time. It's actually a model piece of legislation from ALEC that ends up getting inserted but not quite making it through. Do you think it'll get through this time?
I think it will. That's been a commitment. I mean, a lot of the Republicans behind the scenes said they really wanted this in there. It's failed twice when they introduced it as a standalone bill, mostly because people in the disability rights community were opposed to it. But I think this time they really wanted to get it in, and they did.
Explain the opposition a little bit, because on the one hand you hear people say that the voucher schools aren't as accepting, or they don't have to take the special needs students, and therefore that affects their test scores and performance and budgets. But here this says they would take them. So what's the opposition?
It's really about, from the Republican side, it's about parent choice. If you are a parent of a child with a disability, the belief is that you should be able to choose what school is best for your child. If that's not your home district and you've tried another public school in a different district, but maybe you've been denied because that district couldn't afford to serve you or didn't have a mechanism for serving you in a way that was best for both parties, this would give them another option to go to a private school instead. Critics say this is just one more maneuver to get more kids from public schools into private schools supported by taxpayers.
There's one other issue, one other criticism, and that's what happened in Florida with this, and that is when Jeb Bush was governor, they had a number of cases in which disabled children weren't actually treated or helped when they were at the schools. They were often, there's video and news stories criticizing how the Florida schools, private schools, dealt with the handicapped children.
And as a matter of fact, there's one former voucher school in Wisconsin that actually sort of closed in the dead of night here and then ended up going down to Florida, very easily got into that special needs program and was serving a handful of
And
kids.
I think
there.
that's why you don't see Walker pushing this or getting anywhere near this, because of the potential negative fallout from this.
Yeah, let's do a little look ahead. So there are two more steps to the budget. One is, the full legislature has to finish its action, and then the governor gets it. So from your perspective, what's one thing on the education front that the full legislature is likely to change? If anything.
There's a provision for teacher licensing that would really lower the standards to become a teacher in Milwaukee, and I think that legislators will either take that up or Walker might address it in some way because of opposition.
And Dan, for the governor, what do you think he's backs much of this, all of it, or will he sort of rewrite it? with the
Even
veto
though
pen?
he's lost stuff in here, including the major cut, the $127 million cut to education, I don't see why. There's nothing in here that he can't, as a package, he can't not support in this deal. And he wants to get this budget through as quickly as possible because he has said he won't announce for president until the budget is signed. So if he ends up vetoing a number of provisions, then it goes back to the legislature and it slows down the whole process. So I don't think there's anything in here significant enough to make him decide to slow down the train for his presidential
let's
bid.
look at a couple. We had a lot of reader questions this week that related to education, and before Erin departs on our show today, we wanted to get these in. The first one is the general one. Why is the perception so negative on public schools? What has changed in the past 15 years to drive this? Is the perception negative? Or is it just among certain lawmakers they think it's negative?
Well, I think if you talk to a lot of teachers in public schools, they'd say the climate is definitely kind of a low morale sort of place at the moment. You had Act 10, you've had a lot of criticism about stemming largely from the fact that unions were very powerful and reforms couldn't happen. The dynamic changed with Act 10, and now teachers really still feel like they're sort of being hammered.
But the Marquette poll showed that many voters still like their local public school, and that's why it's hard to make cuts to the budget for your local school if you're a local lawmaker.
All right, and let's throw in one other one here. There are several on the same theme, but this one relates to sort of the accountability question. It's from Nicolay fan, who asked, how can Darling and Republicans say they care about kids in Milwaukee when they do nothing to hold choice schools accountable? Is there anything new on the accountability front in here, or is it sort of the same system, just more schools and kids?
There's a
eligible?
provision in this education package that would call for an entity at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to look at some new assessments that could be used to have all publicly funded schools have some new measures to looking at growth over the course of the year. That's where really the conversation is moving. On the public school side, you hear people say, the more tests you get into the mix, the more you give everybody a choice, the less there's one single measure that we can look at all the schools by.